So without further ado, I would like to welcome Jonathan to our show here. Hi, Jonathan.
Hello, hi everybody. A really diverse group from what I see here. It's beautiful to see. I don't know how many countries are represented here, but my goodness, I feel like I've just stepped into the United Nations. So it's great to see everybody. I'm curious if there's anybody on this call who's actually from the former Soviet Union. Anybody? If you're there, speak up, just curious. Okay, is there anybody from one of the neighboring NATO countries on the call?
I think somebody was unmuting themselves. They were going to say, answer your first question. So somebody unmuted. So we have at least one person from the former Soviet Union.
Yeah, I am, but I was born like after, so it's kind of like different. I was born in 1993, so it was after.
And Sergey, are you from, where are you from?
I'm from Ukraine.
You are? Okay. Well, great. Which town? Where are your folks from?
I don't know. It's like near the capital, maybe 100 miles.
And I certainly hope your families, you have family still there?
My parents here, but like distant relatives, cousins, friends, all other. So yeah.
Yeah. So I'm
curious. Hard time, but
right. I'd be very curious to hear what your folks are saying about all this. You said, and unfortunately you're driving, so I can't see you, but it broke up a little bit. But you said you were born in the United States, correct?
Oh, no. I was just born like after Soviet Union, and just saying it. But I was born in Germany, but anyway.
Oh, you were born in Germany.
Story.
Okay, and then there was another person, I think was from a bordering NATO country. Who is that again?
It's me. I'm from Turkey.
Okay. Right. Turkey's very front and center in this situation as well. You know, the weird thing is that, you know, I asked about the near abroad, as they say in Russia, and then you know, Внутри Советского Союза, as you understand, so but it's something that affects so many nations. And then, of course, I see a number of people from Asia, a few from Africa, perhaps. It's just that important a situation. And this one happens to have, you know, I was talking last night at an event in Brooklyn in which I found myself increasingly describing what's going on as arguably the biggest geopolitical event to hit us since 9/11. And we'll see how it plays out. I mean, there have been economic crises, but something of a nature in which you have the geopolitical tensions and the butting of heads, especially between NATO and all the NATO members, Russia, former Soviet republics caught in the middle of this thing in a political tug of war. And then you have Asia, because you have China and eyeballs looking at Taiwan in relation to the mainland China, and then Japan concerned about what happens with Taiwan. And then India gets pulled into this too. A lot of scrutiny of what India did in terms of a vote at the United Nations in the General Assembly. And India took a neutral stance, you know, avoiding conflict with either side. But it's something that has caused great unease amongst just about every nation on the earth. And that's incredible. And it's very telling about, in a way, how far we've gone and then how little we've gone from the good old days of the Cold War. And I say good old days of the Cold War with a lot of irony. So as Jake mentioned to you, my background was that I began my journalism career just after having worked for a nonprofit organization that was developing the first data links between the Soviet Union and the United States. It was an outfit called Sovam Teleport. And it was a time that most of you, I think, were too young to remember, but Jake may remember. I'm his older brother. But when we were living under the prospect of a nuclear holocaust between the Soviet Union and the United States, we used to do these ridiculous drills of crawling under our desks and pretending to hide behind handball platforms and things like that, as if that would stop an atomic bomb. It was all very ridiculous, but I guess it gave some sort of level of comfort. I would probably think that our friend here, who's and I can't see your name, Sultan, is that right? That you, yes, you might have gone through similar drills, or maybe your parents spoke about drills like that. It's just crazy to be back in a place. The last time I thought about nuclear fallout in a serious way was when Vladimir Putin mentioned that he's putting his nuclear arsenal on high alert and putting the technicians in position should some buttons have to be pressed. And that's a terrible place to find ourselves. So I don't want to talk too much, but because I want to hear your questions. But then just to fill in a little bit more, I covered in probably news in probably many of your countries. As Jake mentioned, conflicts. Jake actually has a background in journalism as well. And we sometimes laugh about that. Who's the real journalist? It's a cute little thing that we have back and forth.
The answer to that, Jonathan, we can be very honest. So I covered mostly South America, Central America, North America, and some of Asia, but I also covered Hollywood. So because I covered Hollywood, Jonathan never considers me a real hard journalist. Although just like Jonathan, I've been shot at and tear gassed. But Jonathan definitely has spent most of his career in the news world as a hard journalist, whereas I was a hard journalist and a soft journalist. And Hollywood, I would say, is very much a much lighter story than a conflict that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, this is for real. The other thing is often not for real, except for sales and ticket sales and movie sales, which is really real because the economy of it all. But in any event, I covered the collapse of the Soviet Union. I set up a news bureau there called Worldwide Television News, which is now Associated Press Television. They bought Worldwide Television News, and I covered the collapse of the Soviet Union. I interviewed all 15 leaders of the former Soviet republics, and I was actually in Ukraine at the time when President Kuchma, who is the Ukrainian president, did the deal with Russia, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States, which was signed in Budapest, to hand over Ukraine's nuclear arsenal to Russia for dismantling. And the writing in that agreement was such that Russia would recognize Ukraine's sovereignty, and that nations, the Europeans and the United States would stand up for Ukraine should something go wrong. There was nothing mentioned in that writing about US and British and French boots on the ground if we were to have a scenario like what we're witnessing. So it's a very curious time. An ironic thing at the time was that the president of Ukraine, President Leonid Kuchma, he was actually formerly a director of a missile manufacturing plant, one that was creating the actual delivery devices for nukes. So it was, I remember clearly how having him standing in front of his nation saying it's a good idea to get rid of our nuclear arsenal. And at the time, just to give you a sense of what that meant, there were three major nuclear powers at the time of that deal. It was Russia, the United States, and Ukraine. Ukraine had the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world. And I assure you that this is something that is painful for Ukrainians to remember and to think of the goodwill and how they felt that the best thing to do was to give up their nukes and to be embraced by the Western Europeans and the Western world, and move away from Moscow as a policy of this central control, move away from the autocratic rule that they experienced under communism, which really wasn't communism. We all know that wasn't communism, and to move into a more Western posture. And I think we see very clearly why Ukraine was clamoring to become a member of NATO. But I'm going to stop talking right now because I'd love to hear from all of you and answer any questions you may have. So with that, Jake, I guess you'll handle the many people here.
Sure. While people are formulating their questions, let's just talk for a little bit, just because I know a little bit of your background. So I may be able to ask a few questions that let people think a little bit what they want to ask. Let's talk a little bit about your career and the transition going into news, and then your involvement with the UN and what happened there in terms of senior policy advisement and things of that nature. I think it'd be very interesting for people to get a sense of different types of careers that people can have, right? So in my journalism background, even though I went more mainstream entertainment and global tech, I still pull on a lot of my journalism skills in what I do. So I think a little bit of your background would be really helpful for people to get a sense of, not only have you covered a lot of different countries and conflicts and some things that are, of course, wonderful. Not everything is a devastating conflict in news, but a lot of news is pretty heavy. So it'd be great to get a sense of that diplomatic access that you've had, and you working with diplomats at the UN and things of that nature. So that would be very interesting.
Yeah, so I don't know. Good question, Jake. So I don't know what the career aspirations of everybody here are.
We're learning about you, so don't worry about other people. This is more of people getting a sense of, here's an individual who was working in a nonprofit, ended up in the news world, and this is kind of the journey of this individual. That's a very helpful thing in these talks for people to get a sense of transferable skills and things of that nature. So it'd be great to just get a sense of you. I know all the answers to what I just asked you or asked you to talk about, but I think it's important for, just to hear it from you. What type of world continued on as you went into different careers?
Sure. So from a very young age, I understood that there was a wider world out there, something that many of you are foreign students, and I'm sure it's a little bizarre looking how insular the United States can be sometimes, and clueless about other cultures and sensibilities. Jake and I came from a family in which I guess we were taught about the other world. Our parents were somewhat evolved compared to sort of mainstream Americans. So there was this fascination that I had as a child of China, Russia, and Africa. Our mother used to subscribe, actually still subscribes and still collects all the Nat Geos from every sort of country. And I used to, leaf through those, and I loved the maps and was curious about the different cultures and that type of thing. And that resonated with me. And as I'm talking now, I'm just realizing as Jake and I have been filing away these Nat Geo magazines, and I've opened up a few and looked at them, and it's now just dawning on me just how influential that probably was on us. And this sense that there's a role to play in the world, and, not in some sort of grandiose sense of things, but in a sense that the world really is a village when you look at it, and wherever you end up landing, and you've learned this from coming to the United States, that society where you are becomes your reality. And though, of course, you're nostalgic about home and some of the concerns that are happening on the home front, you really become part of where you are. And realizing just how similar the problems are of people and the struggles, and how you are who you are wherever you go, and you can have an impact there. It just impressed me, and throughout my career, and I'm going to just mention for a stint, I was working in Hollywood. Nothing like what Jake's done, but I worked on a motion picture and a couple of shoots, and for me, I felt that, and Jake, you may push back at this. I felt it was a little la la land. I love the visuals, I love the storytelling, but it was too far from real life for me. and I wanted to be on the front edge of real life. So journalism was the perfect mix of, and especially television journalism, of bringing visuals and storytelling and reality and realism and affecting change that I could possibly think of. And it was really wonderful. I had a great career in journalism, traveled around the world. But when I was offered the opportunity to be the director of communications of the US mission to the United Nations, I thought, wow, this is going to be a wonderful opportunity to actually shape policy. Because as a journalist, as much as millions of eyeballs are watching your stories and you're affecting things, you're not part of the story. You feel like you are, but you're really an observer. And to be on the, actually involved in policy making, to be helping with the decisions in big stakes, like, the Iran nuclear deal, the war in Syria, North Korea rocket fire, Ukraine, Russia, by the way, that was something that I had to deal with. India, Pakistan, these things were real and tangible, and they affected millions of people. And for me, working in the State Department was just a wonderful opportunity to have impact in that space, and also to represent the United States and feel like I was doing something that was both meaningful for my country, for the people involved in the conflict. And I discovered that my journalism career, and I was not a foreign service, excuse me, I didn't rise through the ranks of the foreign service in the United States, but I realized the journalism experience and the experience that I had working for that NGO trying to foster relations between the United States and the Soviet Union put me in good stead, that I was able to go toe-to-toe with some of these foreign service officers. And in many ways, I had more experience than they did, real tangible experience, because I knew what it's like to be on the front line of a war. I knew what it's like to be at the negotiating table, covering negotiations. I knew what natural disasters are really like, because I had to cover them and live amongst the people suffering from them. And it brought a level of knowledge and real life experience that was really helpful. And I discovered when I shifted over to senior policy work that, and I was, having discussions with the parties themselves about their issues, it gave me a level of empathy that was credible. It wasn't just showing empathy and caring. I really knew it in many cases. So, for instance, the flare-up with Ethiopia over the last year and a half, I'd been there and I was able to talk to the parties about what was going on and understanding the war that Ethiopia had with Eritrea. And, these things do matter. So did that answer your question, Jake?
It did. I think, we think sometimes that we're in a particular industry and that's what we do. And what we don't realize is that we are part of a much larger picture. The reason why I asked you your situation is that yours was very unique. Mine was also very unique in terms of how I transitioned out of journalism. And the one thing that I would say in terms of the Hollywood and the international feel that we're talking about is that this is the part where I think you and I have differed over the years a little bit, is that Hollywood has, and Hollywood, Bollywood, other places that do a lot of cinema throughout the world, sometimes they shed light on major worldwide issues and are able to shed light in a larger audience, to a larger audience. So maybe in a very successful feature film or a feature documentary, and sometimes when it's fictionalized a little bit, people get a little bit of an understanding or a taste of a region, and then they want to learn more. So I think while there is a lot in entertainment that as a formal journalist, sometimes makes me cringe because I think it's a disservice to humanity. I think sometimes there's a really wonderful spotlight that entertainment, scripted and unscripted projects can shed. So I think that's the exposure. Maybe it's all the smoothies that I've had in California and all of the freshly squeezed juice, as opposed to the coffee that you guys in New York are drinking so much of. No, I kid you, Jonathan. But I think that's probably I think there's a balance, and I love the fact that you and I come from two different hard news backgrounds, and it's very, very healthy look at the world.
Yeah, it's interesting that you're saying this about motion pictures that scrutinize certain world events, and I'm not going to go into detail because it's a client, but I was speaking to a client specifically about that, suggesting that a script be written about the particular conflict and that a motion picture be made about it, because that's the only way to get America to care about their particular plight. And it's true. And there have been feature films done about, there was a series about Chernobyl. People get moved by these things, and there will be a motion picture about, it's post factum, so it's not helpful now in terms of understanding, but it does make sense. So I actually was advising exactly what you just said, Jake, which is funny.
There you go. The young, I think the thing that for the group here is, when you're at the United Nations and when you see people from so many different, geopolitical beliefs and understandings of their world in the larger context, tell us a little bit about that situation, because you have high-level officials who are tasked with policy that legitimately impact the globe, not just that particular country. So talk a little bit about what that experience is like, seeing deep difference of opinion at the UN and other geopolitical opportunities.
So when you spend a lot of time at the UN, and I don't know whether anybody in this forum here has spent time there, because sometimes some people do internships there. Has anybody spent time at the UN? No. So we have this perception of the UN as a place. If I'm gonna take a couple of pot shots at the UN, and please forgive me. The UN has great utility in some areas, and it is the worst possible place to turn for conflict resolution in others. In fact, it exacerbates some conflicts. So in specifically addressing your question about world leaders and trying to get things done, I feel that the war in Syria, for instance, had it not been fought also in terms of rhetoric at the United Nations, I think that conflict would not have blown into the full-scale war that we all witnessed, and the horrendous loss of life and torture and everything, all the just maim people. All that could have been avoided had Hillary Clinton and Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, who's now you're seeing on the news representing Vladimir Putin, had they sat down and talked things through, and there was a way to mediate that and get an outcome that would have made Russia feel confident and would have made the United States feel confident, because at the end of the day, that was a somewhat another Cold War embedded conflict. Largely Russia feeling pinched at their representation in the Mediterranean Sea and Tartus, where they have a naval base and their only warm water naval base in the world, able to monitor the Mediterranean Sea, but everything else around there. And Russia, the Soviet Union, had a relationship with Syria since the 40s, a military pact. And the United States and the Western Europeans were making them feel very uncomfortable. And the Russians were willing to go to war and fight for their position on this with brutal force and essentially level cities like Aleppo in the process with indiscriminate bombing. So
Jonathan,
that's a case. That's a case in which the UN was the wrong place to try to bring this, because Russia and China backing them were vetoing every sort of resolution trying to corner the Russians to allow humanitarian aid to go in and other things. And there are other conflicts in which we've seen this type of failure happen. The UN does work, though, when there is a will on the parties to find a solution. But when there isn't a will, and when one side is stronger than the other side, or in which there's a member of the Security Council who feels threatened because they have a vested interest in the conflict, just like we just saw play out with Russia vetoing measures by the other security councils to condemn Russia for invading Ukraine, it's just a non-starter, and the UN should not be the forum.
so in that regard, the thought is that maybe in private diplomatic circles, something like that could have been worked out, as opposed to putting people in public and maybe having egos and reputations on the line, and almost like a bully on a schoolyard situation.
Yeah, because it becomes something in which the ambassador becomes the ambassador represents not only aspirations, if they're a really good, decent ambassador to try to resolve the conflict, but but they're also speaking on behalf of their nation, and what they say becomes domestic consumed material. So they're also worried about perceptions of their own people back home, and any sign of weakness or not espousing the expectations of the people back home can be perceived wrongly. So in the case of Sergei Lavrov, he was feeling a pinch that he's got to really represent Russia with a strong voice. And Hillary Clinton said, I represent the United States and we stand firm on our position. And this is what, that doesn't get you to the point in which you're having a dialogue. You're just shouting at each other. And that's where then the problem can end up getting exacerbated, as opposed to settling down in a quiet diplomatic way, away from the scrutiny of the rest of the world, away from all that internal and external politics, so that you can actually get to the point of having proper diplomacy.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan. Giovanni has a question. Giovanni, go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Jonathan. Thank you, Jack. Hi, Jonathan. Nice to meet you. My name is Giovanni Martinez. I am from the Dominican Republic. So taking in mind that we are in a world where social media, media outlets, even fake news have such a big relevance, do you think that the media in general, and again, the ones that I just mentioned, have a bigger influence in the resolution and the direction of global conflicts, such as the ones that we're seeing, compared to the United Nations and even some governments around the world?
A good question, Giovanni. There's a thing, if you're in journalism, you study a thing called the CNN effect. Not because CNN today is the only watched news channel, but when the first Iraq War broke out, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, and also around the time of when Somalia was in deep conflict. In both cases, you had U.S. and our allies involved in those two conflicts. And it was the first time in which you started to have technology develop at such a level where you were able to get live, or at least virtually live, coverage of world events. And sometimes these events took place in front of the camera's lens before the actual leaders of the countries involved in the conflict or intervening in the conflict were aware of it. And so there was this reactionary type of thing that was happening in which the news itself was driving the policy in certain cases. So for instance, there is the argument that the United States sent military forces to Somalia to help settle things in Somalia because the public outcry of seeing these horrible images was such that there was pressure to get in and do something about it. And then we had the story of Black Hawk Down, the dragging of US troops on the streets of Mogadishu in this ignominious way, and a sense that diplomacy runs into a real problem of trying to find its feet in a world, and an increasing world, in which images are driving passions. And we're seeing it with the reaction to the Ukraine war and Russia war, and what can we do about it? And the people frustrated looking at these horrific images, some people wanting there to be a no-fly zone established over Ukraine, others saying, no, don't do it. But those pressures are happening because it's happening in front of us. We're seeing it. Now, we're looking at those images, and the first thing that came to my mind, and I'm sure to many of you here, when you first started to see that fighting going on in the Ukraine, is I was having this moment in which I was saying, yeah, I'm seeing images that remind me of World War II. And how weird is this? And had there been the level of media technology now in which you could scrutinize what was happening at the time of World War II, who knows whether we would have had the level of bloodshed and horror that befell that continent and beyond. Actually, World War II was fought also in Africa and Asia, and it was a world war that, had those images been coming through, there might have been a pause and maybe an attempt to sue for peace, or at least not get caught into that, because the truth is war is hideous. And I hope none of you have seen it firsthand. I have, and it's traumatizing, and it's depressing, and it's mind-boggling because it's insane. I think these images can either help or actually, in the case of what we saw happen in Somalia, accelerate some of the problems. And also there's an issue in that coverage can sway opinion, sometimes bring emphasis on certain events that may not be that significant in the big picture of an event, but suddenly, just because you see it, it becomes that real, and that's what resonates, and that's what drives your passion. So the news media is essential, of course. A neutral news media is so important. Unfortunately, we live in a time in which that's more not the case than it is the case. And in many ways, that's a problem that needs to be corrected because it drives policy now because of those real images and that impact and the ability to actually story tell, as it were, and fiction tell, in the case of fake news, to so many people, and that impacts our world.
I have thank you for that. I do have a follow-up related to that last point. So from the point of view of a journalist, do you see that there is, or right now in history, we are in a transition point that we are centralizing more the concept of free speech, in which now, for example, you see media outlets such as CNN that are, very clearly taking positions on political issues and so on, and each media outlet and so on, specifically creates a position, but also there are entities or organizations such as Google, Facebook, and so on, that also create certain standards, which for some people, it shows a predetermined direction in terms of the opinions that are accepted, what are some of the points of views that are seen as, facts, non-facts. So I would really want to understand if we're in a point in history where this transition is actually becoming true.
It's depressing. It's a good question, Giovanni. It's depressing. I'm going to tell you anecdotally about something that happened the other night. So I was on WABC talking about the Ukraine conflict, and the interviewer was clearly someone who was a right-wing Republican. And he started to bash Biden and Obama. And he asked me a question that, I felt that I was being baited to answer a certain way. And I made the criticism that all the last three presidents have been too weak on trying to contain the situation, the mindset of Vladimir Putin. And I laid out that Obama, when in 2014, when Russia seized Ukraine, there should have been more pushback at the time, because Putin had already invaded the Republic of Georgia, and territories of Georgia were then recognized by Russia as independent. And there was this win that happened there, a win in Crimea, and Obama should have pushed back harder with sanctions. And then he said, yes, 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 but nothing happened under Trump. And so I spoke to the truth that under the Trump years, the truth is that Russian forces were supporting separatists in Donbass and eastern Ukraine, and they were solidifying their hold on Crimea. And the atrocities were going on in Syria at the time. And then I talked about Biden and my belief that President Biden, a couple of months ago, when Russia was amassing troops on the Ukrainian border, both he and the German chancellor should have been pushing to do something more with more muscle, to try to signal that there'll be consequences like we're seeing right now, and being serious about it back then. And maybe we could have averted the conflict. My comments about President Trump's presidency sent this guy into a wild craze. And I managed to sort of deflect it, and we moved on and we talked about other things. But then after the exchange, this guy wouldn't stop texting me. He was enraged. And no matter what I said, didn't matter. And that's how polarized our world is, in which you can't even speak to the truth anymore sometimes. And that is really depressing. So, and then on another channel, I was taking the position that, explaining the mindset of Vladimir Putin, perhaps, although, there have been reports that maybe there's a level of mania that's kicked in that actually, propelled him to actually do the invasion. But explaining the pain that psychologically NATO has had on him, in that this is a former KGB official who operated in East Germany, remembers a time when the Soviet Union was such a major superpower, and resentful that the former Soviet republics of Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia joined NATO, and understanding the stakes of what that has meant to the near abroad for Russia, and looking at Ukraine and its aspirations for NATO membership as something that created great anxiety for Vladimir Putin, and something that he found completely unacceptable. And in saying that, from the left side, I took heat. How dare you essentially defend Vladimir Putin's position? Whereas I was just trying to explain the psychology of an individual growing up and actually being in an influential role within that world, and facing the West and squaring off at the West, and seeing himself as a modern day czar, and tired of feeling second best to the United States. And that's truthful, but I took heat for that. So I think it's all of our responsibility, everybody here, to try to push the press, and we all know journalists, but to push for more honesty, to push for more neutrality, for a sense of understanding conflicts in the context of where they are. It's true there is evil in the world, and evil does come up, and there are terrible things that happen. And as journalists, we have to do something. There's a really horrible story of a photographer, and you are mostly too young to remember this, but there was a terrible famine in Ethiopia. And there was a photojournalist who took a picture of a child who was dying of starvation, and that child ultimately died. And I think he might have committed suicide, that journalist, but I know that he went through a horrible state of depression that he didn't do anything to help that child. And so there are times in which, and that's an extreme case, in which journalists can't help but get engaged and help. And I've been on news stories where I've helped people who have been affected. I had an incident in which a border policeman was shot through the heart, and my crew asked, one of them was a medic, a cameraman, and he pleaded with me, can I put my camera down and save this man's life? And that's what happened. He intervened and saved this man's life, so miraculously, by the way, because the guy got shot through the heart, of all things. And I've helped, refugee children who are, in dire need. I've given them candy bars and Cliff bars and that type of thing over the years. And you try to help. But in terms of, a major conflict and taking a side on something where you have, narratives on both sides, and often legitimate narratives, then it gets very dicey. But when it comes to human suffering in front of us, there really shouldn't be that level of neutrality. We're human beings at the end of the day, and we have to take care of one another.
Thank you, Jonathan. Chen Xing, do you have a question?
Actually, you were mentioned about Russian-Ukraine's tension goes on for years, and because you are a geopolicy expert, so I want to ask you about, because in Putin's speech, he mentioned about the NATO expansion was the reason why the war is happening, right? So it is absolutely an invasion war. I don't think it is justified or anything, but for my understanding, that NATO was formed on the purpose of defense of Warsaw Pact after World War II, during the Cold War, right? So, and after the Soviet Union discarded and the members of the pact left Warsaw Pact and joined NATO, and what's the imaginary enemy of NATO, I think? So they're still putting, that means the NATO still exists because of, and the expansion because of Russia still the imaginary enemy.
I'm trying to understand. You're making a point, Tianya, or is there a question in there somewhere?
Actually, I think it's I want you to expand that a little bit more on a geopolicy side. Yeah. Yeah.
So one of the difficulties, and President Yeltsin, when he took over after Gorbachev, and Putin can't stand Gorbachev. Putin looks at Gorbachev as the biggest traitor of his nation. He still believes in the Soviet Union. Yeltsin was really just a Russian nationalist. I'm not saying that in a disparaging way. He just loved the Russian people and he wanted his country to be great. And he did not want to control the other republics. He wanted, of course, to have them be friendly nations. But there was this exuberance that came through at that time, that it was an opportunity for peoples of Kazakhstan, of Uzbekistan, and all these different republics to actually have self-determination. And he was okay with that, as long as they didn't meddle with Russia, and as long as those parts of the Russian Federation where you had historic tensions like Tatarstan or Dagestan or Ossetia, and some of these other regions didn't stir up ethnic problems and conflict. He was fine with that. I think it's, there's trauma, there's psychological trauma that affected Eastern Europe from the Soviet days. And, you know, it's understandable if your parents went through something and, you know, World War II, when I was born in 1965, World War II ended just 20 years before I was born. You know, the generation just before me had lived through that and saw the perils, saw the dangers. And from a, you know, I mentioned the Baltic states that were former republics of the Soviet Union. I can understand that trauma and the desire, if your country had been occupied by a foreign army, that you would want to do whatever you can to ensure that never happens again, that your sovereignty would be safeguarded. And arguably, and this is going to be defensive of a Russian nationalist position, whenever that happened, they felt, you know, this is something affecting our border. This is an area where we once controlled things and we didn't have to worry about their policies. And this was our wider world and our impact. You know, one of the issues that's come up at the United Nations, for instance, is Puerto Rico in the context of the United States. What is Puerto Rico? Is it a country? Is it part of the United States? Puerto Rico itself doesn't know what it is. You know, it's a very divided population. But you have certain beliefs and personal sensibilities about conflicts in the world and territorial integrity and what matters to your country or what matters to your people and your culture. And in the case of Russia, it's always, you know, historically for hundreds of years, it's been a very impressive player on the world stage, going back into Imperial Russia. And at one point, Crimea was indeed part of Ekaterina the Great's naval power within the Black Sea. And these things are part of the culture, the national sensibilities of a people, and they remain. And in a conflict like Ukraine, you know, there are two different narratives. That area actually was largely populated by the Tatars, which were a Muslim group. They converted to Islam, and Stalin, you know, dispersed them because he was afraid of nationalism, and they were dispersed, and they mostly populated in Central Asia in an area called Tartarstan, which was where their core presence has maintained. But it was always this aspiration of Russia beyond its borders that has always freaked out its neighbors, and given this sense that any weakness might be perceived as an opportunity for Russia's re-involvement in their territory. It cuts both ways. You know, you can understand it from a Russian nationalist position that NATO expansion was encroaching on areas of influence of Russia, and vice versa. It's that superpower status of Russia, which it's not as strong as it once was, but it's no weakling. But that needs to be contained, because history has shown that when it's not contained, it expands.
So, Jonathan, thank you for the detailed explanation there. We have the questions that are up now are going to be the last questions, because we have 5 of them coming for you. I'm sorry, I promised you'd be out of here faster than you are. So, Samuel, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I just wanted to understand if there are like any regulations regarding propaganda, because, for example, in Russia now, like all independents, like journalism are closed, everything's closed, and like, for example, people who are like talking about real situation can get like 15 years in jail. It just like was approved like 2 days ago. And I just wondered if there are like any international regulation, because like, for example, they even blocked Facebook and Twitter right now. So people in a country still thinking that, for example, Ukrainians are killing Ukrainians and Russians are gonna help them from like Nazi Ukrainians, kind of. And I just wondering if there are like any regulations around it, and if there are like any possible things that, like, I don't know, international like journalists may do regarding that, like influence it somehow.
The answer is not really, which is suppressing, but really not really. Autocratic countries love what's happening in Russia now. So if you're trying to control your media, and a lot of countries still have state media, and that's the voice box. That's it. That's all people hear and consume. It's an autocrat's dream. And unfortunately, within the United Nations, you have a lot of countries that are not democratic. So that's music to their ears, and they would love to have that type of ability to shut things down and to scare people into speaking out, dissuade them from speaking out the way that would be contrary to what they're believing and wanting to be heard. So there are journalism groups. There's condemnation that's happened, but it doesn't matter if you're ruling a country. That's it. I mean, you control the airwaves. And this goes back to the question for Giovanni. I mean, the news does shape opinion, period. And when the news is a parrot of what the government believes, unfortunately, those beliefs are what are consumed, digested, and heard on a daily basis. I have friends who I knew from my time working in the former Soviet Union. And some of them were journalists, and we've communicated in the midst of this conflict over those encrypted communications abilities. And some of them one of them in particular, I'm brokenhearted by what is being written, because it sounds like too much Kool-Aid has been had over the course of the last couple of months. And it freaks me out because I really respected this journalist. And then I have, Russian friends who are writing very cautiously about the conflict, not exposing themselves because they're paranoid that the encryption that's claimed on this thing might not be that great. And they could get in a lot of trouble because, this is all written out and can be used as evidence against them. So that fear, that level of fear domestically, I'm afraid, is so intense that it's going to be hard to break. And a 15-year jail sentence certainly would make me think twice about doing something. Unfortunately, what strength do we have to do something other than condemnation, ridiculing? I had this incident when I was working at the State Department in which the North Koreans had used an ICBM test, and the Russians decided that they didn't want to admit it, they didn't want to say it, whatever it was, that was going to be the position. I'm sorry that this is becoming an America versus Russia thing, but anecdotally, this just happened, and Russia was espousing in its state media that this was not an ICBM, and this was the United States trying to sell the case that it was an ICBM when it really wasn't. And the Russian tracking station had determined it wasn't an ICBM. And we had to expose the truth to the Security Council, and the Russians were in the room. They didn't change their position, but the evidence was abundantly clear. Everybody understood it, including those who were questioning it because the Russians were saying what they were saying, but it just wasn't true. But at the end of the day, what was reported in Russia was their narrative, which wasn't the truth. And what can we do about it? Nothing. There's nothing that can be done about it. The only thing that we can do is to ridicule that type of journalism, and to hope very much that the truth manages to get its way into the country so that people know what's really happening. Did that answer your question?
Yep. Thank you.
All right. Let's go on to thank you, Jonathan. Let's go on to Sonal.
Hi, Jonathan. I have a question for you, and
Maybe for the example, I can use the ongoing Russia and Ukraine. So I wanted to check with you, what are your thoughts on, the media forecasting or predictions? For example, in the current war, though there is a ceasefire, but the media predictions are there could be a nuclear war, and then, some places the media also says it could eventually, move towards World War III. So sometimes I feel, because this is not currently the fact, but a possibility. So it, somewhere also could create some kind of chaos, or, people could get scared or fear. It could spread fear, because at one side we say spreading positivity, and then it is also a spread of fear. So I wanted to know, what are your thoughts on, if, this is right, and is there a limit till where media, does their predictions? Because this is also a point of view, maybe of a group, or, a particular person or so. So what are
Right.
your thoughts on
I
that?
mean,
Yeah.
my thoughts, just like I've been speaking to you, some of you may have said, hey, this dude's got a little bias in one corner or another, or what's he saying? I very much welcome your question, because you're discerning certain things that need to be scrutinized, and understanding that we're all human, and there sometimes is a vested interest of some journalists to be espousing a certain position because of their close relationship with government officials, because they're ethically of one type versus another, and then find themselves in a particular position because of that emotional connection that they have, that's cultural and ethnic. And that all matters, and it does impact things. And sometimes it drives, going back to Giovanni's question from a different angle, it does drive the way that perception happens within the consumer, the viewers who are listening to this. And, I've heard people come on, commentators on CNN, on Fox, on MSNBC, on BBC. I haven't agreed with their position. I really haven't. And some things have been said that are quite irresponsible. And I worry about it. And then, sometimes it's not their fault, because this stuff is really difficult. There's an argument that Biden should be so strong, and there should be no room given to allow Vladimir Putin to have an off-ramp from what's happening. Because if you're firm, then it just gives the right message, and then we're all okay. And then there's the other argument that this guy's going to put himself in the corner like a caged crazy bear, and he's going to lash out and do something irrational. Well, both arguments are kind of right in a way. So who is right, really? And it does get fuzzy. The important thing is to hear both those positions, and then to make your own decision on the basis of those things that you're hearing, especially when it gets complicated, because there really are these gray areas, and they're inevitable. And that's why there are conflicts in the first place. Otherwise everything would be kumbaya, but it can't be, because the human condition, the competitiveness amongst nations, amongst peoples, territorially, culturally, ethnically, historically, grievances that go back generations. These are difficult things to grapple with. And when they come to the surface as individuals, and I try to get news from a variety of sources. I try to understand the conflict and its complexities, and then look at what the various outcomes can be, and try to find a way in which you can bridge the differences and try to bring about some sort of mutual understanding, as opposed to creating increasing tension that can lead to worse outcomes than we all want to see happen.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Javier, I think you're up next.
Hey, hi, Jonathan. Thanks for all sharing your knowledge with us. I just have one question from your experience. What do you think is motivating Putin right now to do what he's doing in Ukraine? Everything seems to be against him, but he seems to be confidently keeping his actions against Ukraine. Why now? Why not 2 years ago? Or why not waiting a little bit longer?
So I touched on some of this earlier from a rational perspective. And again, I said to you, I don't think war is particularly rational. But from a rational perspective, he comes at it, a guy who for decades has said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the worst thing to happen within recent modern history, period, in the world. That's his belief. So any way to reclaim the Soviet Union is obviously his aspiration. So the motivation's always been there. He's an opportunist, and he obviously felt that there was enough weakness that it was an optimal time. The Germans are relying on, or and now it's changing, but we're relying and still are relying on Russian fossil fuels. And they would do nothing to disrupt the Nord Stream pipeline that was going to bring in additional fuel. And he felt very secure that Germany would do, would not get freaked out by something. And then maybe there's the argument that Biden was not strong enough at the beginning, and he felt that weakness and felt that this was a great opportunity too. I don't buy it, but I do buy my own criticism that I do feel the Biden administration, and this is coming from me, I feel that more could have been done earlier on, and I think that was a big failure. And I think he was emboldened by the 3 presidencies under his watch, because Vladimir Putin's been president for 22 years, if you call him a president. And I think he felt, the Americans didn't push back much when we got Crimea. They didn't push back much on Donbass, and this is a chance to assert actually a stronger hold on those territories. I question what the rest is all about, and the motivation there, from my perspective, is he just wants to win. Vladimir Putin wants to win, and there have been real setbacks. And winning is everything, because it's the national pride. It's his pride. He's the leader, the czar of the Russian people. He's got to win. So this situation, given where we are now, is going to get worse unless there's a way to give him a win, or at least to be able to sell to his people that he won. And that's to be determined. What is that win? And that win can be any number of things. But at the end of the day, there is going to be some great suffering and some major compromises that may have to happen to satiate his appetite for a win. And how big that win is, and how much does he need a win?
Thanks, Jonathan. We're holding you way over time, so I'm just gonna let's ask some quick questions here, and
I'll rapidly answer them. Sorry, I'm long in the tooth.
No. I think we love the answers, because they're genuine, and they're what people are trying to find out. So thank you for that. But let's keep our questions brief, and so Jonathan will be able to get on with his evening. I know you're 3 hours ahead of us here on the West Coast. So, okay, go ahead.
Thanks for this session. I wanted to ask you, what is your opinion about the worldwide effects in short term and long term of this crisis? Do you have any opinions, or I know this is a hard question, but
it's created, and I started out this conversation saying this is the biggest event, probably geopolitical event, since 9/11. And 9/11 caused so many reverberations, some that are felt today still. Things that are going on in the Middle East for sure are interwoven with what happened with that. You can also say that if you look at the line of history, it's not like events end and then it's all over and that's behind it. When you have big events like 9/11, that you could probably find connective tissues, and I haven't thought this through completely, but leading up to everything all the way running through ISIS, all the way through Afghanistan, all the way through Pakistan and India, and the Uyghurs and China, and all of this stuff is interwoven. The world just works that way when you have a big event. This is one such event in which what it means to be the European Union, what it means to be NATO, what it means to be Russian, what it means to be China, what it means to be India in this context and voting, what it means to be Armenia, what does fossil fuel mean to the world? Should we be drilling more now to deal with the oil crisis, or should we be rushing as fast as we possibly can to use alternative energy? And this is a telltale sign of the difficulties that wait, and the longer we're dependent on oil, we're going to see conflicts like this. All these arguments are affecting everything. All our lives are affected. When we go to tank up at the gas station, now we're feeling the conflict. And it really, this stuff really matters. So your question is that we are going to see a shift. We're going to see a shift in attitudes about energy. We're going to see a shift in attitudes about geopolitics. We're going to see a shift in economic considerations. We're going to see a shift in what it means to be an autocrat and what it doesn't. We're going to see a shift in military might and weaponry and how nations feel about their ability to defend themselves. Everything gets affected here. Literally everything. Was that enough?
Yes, thank you.
I think that was a very good question and answer. Leila, go ahead.
Thank you, Jonathan. I did not realize you were actually all the way on the East Coast. But thank you so much for your time and all the talk that you've had so far. So mine's more of a peacetime question than the current scenario or a wartime one. So as a journalist, and especially with the entire UN experience that you've had in dealing with a lot of countries and cultures, and especially when you're a journalist and you see an event and you try to report it, you need to understand all the more culturally, whether it's a positive event or a negative event, because as a stranger, you might not actually make out the entire impact of it. So my question to you is, how do you get to know people, other people's culture? What's a good way to approach, especially now, we've like you've mentioned, we're all students from different parts of the world. We get to meet many more people from different parts of the world. How is it that we could strike up a conversation and get to know each other culturally better, and what's right for somebody? How do you basically get more empathetic is what I'm probably asking.
Yeah, I mean, what makes us tick as individuals is a very personal thing. But at the end of the day, there are common threads, and there are cultural narratives that really make people tick. All of us, each of us have some allegiance to something because we're the offspring of the parents of the parents of the parents, and generational sensibilities. I can guess by your surname, your ethnic background, and it and having that sensibility is helpful. As journalists, we would often be what's called parachuted into situations where, all of a sudden you're sitting in New York City, and next thing you know, you're covering the tsunami in Sri Lanka, for instance, and you're dealing with emotional things that are happening with the people there on every sort of level. I mean, what are you going to do with dead people? How do they deal with their dead? How do they deal with injured people? How do they handle humanitarian aid? Who gets the aid? There are ethnic tensions within some of these countries. You have the Tamils and the Sinhalese in Sri Lanka, for instance. How do you cope in dealing with these different conflicting zones when you have these human needs that come into play? And I guess the short answer to your long answer, your question that begs a long answer, is quickly get a read. I used to do, and it's going to sound really ridiculous, but I would immediately do the printout, on Google. You'd be able to find resources, and then I'd have our research department print up the CIA study of the country that I was going to, and when I was flying over to wherever I was going, and sometimes I'd hit the ground and I was covering the war, I at least had read through and understood the material and the subject matter as best I can. But then next thing I know, I've landed and I'm in Darfur, and I'm learning what the Janjaweed are all about, and I'm learning what the SLA is all about, fighting them, and it's hard work. But you try to hit the ground with as much of an understanding of what it is, understanding the geopolitics of it too, because in that case, there was China involved in the resources there, and some of the neighboring countries, and how it affected them, the Central African Republic. And it gets really complicated and ends up being both domestic and geopolitical, that every story, even a bank robbery, a robbery of the convenience store in Oakland, even that has so much tension and story behind it, and the guy who's working behind the counter, and the man who's had the motivation to come in and at gunpoint ask for money, what the motivations are that bring these two sides together in conflict. Life is a complicated thing. So when it comes to foreign affairs and covering foreign stories, it truly is trying as best as you can to culturally identify and historically identify with the individuals involved in this particular story.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Kirtana, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, hi, Jonathan. So my question is, again, coming back to the current scenario. Now that most of the Western companies are withdrawing from Russia, right? So how does this monopoly play out for the rest of the world about being self-dependent on their own resources, or how are they requiring aid from the Western companies? How will it be moving forward from now onwards?
Yeah, Kirtana, good question. In the case of Russia, the history of the country going back to the time of serfs, the indentured servants on the land, all the way through to the Russian Revolution, all the way through the Soviet era, the Russians are resilient people. They can withstand not having. They can. And a concern is that it'll be a more introspective nation. They have so many resources. It's the biggest country in the world, and they can become increasingly insular and largely ride this out. So though the sanctions, and I understand where they're coming from, and I personally feel they have to be slapped on Russia now, because there has to be this recognition that war is not the answer. It can only go so far, and I think there's also Russia's ability. It has geopolitical friends, and the ability to ride this out with some very influential friends and neighbors, and some within various continents, Venezuela and Nicaragua and South America and Central America, Cuba and the Caribbean. There are a couple of African nations that have leaning towards Russia, China, North Korea. There are ways in which the country can function, albeit maybe not on the level of what it's witnessed and what its people are used to having. I mean, it's got to be painful not to have MasterCard, but then the Russians will work out their own internal system, and there's been this effort afoot by China, Russia, and a couple other countries to try to do away with the central role that the US dollar plays. So this might accelerate that move as well. This goes back to that question about how this impacts geopolitics in our world. I think this is going to have enormous impact on the monetary system, for instance.
So, Jonathan, I know there are a few more questions, but I think, to be generous to you, if people have questions that they still want answered, are you going to be okay with sending that information through me to get back to students here? Is
Sure.
that okay? Great.
We'll do that.
So I appreciate you spending the extra time with us. What you've said has been brilliant. I've known you for a long time and have known of your brilliance for a long time. And I'm glad you're able to shed that here as well, so that everyone else could experience that. With deep appreciation, I say thanks for joining us.
It was a real pleasure. And I hope everybody understands that we're all diplomats at the end of the day. And, you know, whatever I've said, if things have resonated, terrific. If you disagree, I'd love to have spoken to you about it. And I'm sorry we had limited time. But don't forget, we all impact our world. And I guess leaving this conversation, I hope that this has been helpful in framing things. I just welcome all you playing an instrumental role in your own lives and your own circles, because we're all human beings, all very fragile at the end of the day, and all capable of making mistakes, but also capable of great things. And it's the latter that I hope we all can work together to make this a better world.
Thank you, Jonathan. Now, don't leave yet. I'm going to take a picture of everyone here. So everyone get, we're going to take a picture here. So I'm going to count down to 3. And I know we were talking about some serious stuff, but please smile. And Jonathan, here we go. 3, 2. All right. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for being here. I'm going to be hanging out with everyone here for a little bit while longer, but you have a great rest of your evening. And I bet you that you and I will talk soon.
We certainly will. Good luck, everybody. Enjoy the class.
Thank you.
Jake's a lot of fun. He knows a lot of things too. Okay.
Bye, Jonathan. See you later. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
All right. So there you go. I hope that was helpful for all of you.